In this video, we'll be discussing literature reviews. I know, everyone's favorite thing to do for fun after work. Our objectives today are to describe and explain the purpose of a literature review, to understand 3 structures for writing a literature review, and to touch briefly on the writing process itself. Let's get an idea of what a literature review does and what exactly it is. The purpose is to summarize the current body of literature related to some phenomenon, or multiple phenomenon. The structure is driven by content, key themes, and the problem you've identified, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The goal is to provide a comprehensive synthesis of relevant and related information. Think about the term itself. It's a review, or a summary, critique, or synthesis of literature, relevant scientific research. In terms of actually writing the review itself, there are 3 structures you might think about using. They are the funnel, the timeline, and themes. To be sure, these are not the only ways to write a literature review, and personal style, as well as the topic itself, will also dictate the way in which a literature review is completed. Let's first take a look at the funnel structure. This structure goes from a very broad idea to a very specific one and tries to narrow down and focus until there is an idea or concept of most importance. Let's say you're interested in how bad leadership might impact employees. You might start with the idea that leadership is an important aspect of organizational behavior. Then you focus and narrow down from there. Specifically, supervisors have certain leadership styles. Specifically, a bad leadership style can impact employees. And more specifically, bad behaviors can cause employees to lose morale and job satisfaction. The next example is the timeline. In this structure, you give the reader a sense of how a concept or a topic has evolved over time. This can be an important way to view a problem if, for example, it has historic significance or has a long history of study. Again, let's imagine you're writing about leadership. Once upon a time, we thought leadership was a trait. Then, we learned that leadership skills can be taught. But now we know that teaching people to be leaders is not perfect science. And we learn that leadership impacts employees in these ways. Lastly, here's what we know today. Finally, we have a structure using themes. This is probably the most common and most straightforward structure that's utilized. I personally recommend using it because it makes papers very clear and easy to read, and it ties really nicely into purpose statement that you'll be utilizing for this class. Here's an example of a purpose statement from a hat paper for this class. This student wrote, "The purpose of this research is to explore the relationship between military members voluntarily separating and the level of morale he or she has when making the decision to transition to civilian life." When I read this purpose statement, 3 things stand out to me as important. First, this paper will discuss military employment. Second, the paper will discuss voluntary separation or turnover. And lastly, this paper focuses on morale. Noting these important items will then help to structure the paper. In this case, under the heading of Literature Review, I would expect to see subheadings of military employment, voluntary turnover, and employee morale. I like to use the metaphor of building blocks to describe this structure, as all of these pieces have to build on one another and link together. Much like I described the way that theory is a framework for your paper, these building blocks are attached to your framework to make a more complete product. As you're writing your paper, here are some strategies that might help you. Code and classify the articles you find and the themes you see. Organization helps in the long run. Prepare an outline or a map. Though this may change as you write, it will help to keep your thoughts focused. Write your first draft well before the due date. Then wait a few days. Then go back and revisit your draft, making changes where you can. Lastly, remember some of these tips. Use Google Scholar and the U of L library to help you find sources of information. Check the references of the articles you find to find even more articles. And if you're having trouble finding articles, try broadening or changing your search terms.